Sometimes the most powerful people walk among us in disguise, their true identities hidden behind ordinary uniforms and quiet demeanors. They blend into crowds, follow orders without question, and endure humiliation with grace, not because they're weak, but because their real mission demands absolute secrecy. What happens when someone mistakes that carefully constructed facade for actual weakness? What occurs when authority figures abuse their power against someone they believe has no recourse, no connections, no ability to fight back? The answer lies in understanding that the most dangerous opponents are often those who appear completely harmless. They're the ones who've learned to hide their strength so well that even trained military officers can't detect the lethal capabilities beneath the surface. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a woman whose true identity was so classified that even her own academy instructors had no idea they were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. It's about what happens when a carefully maintained cover is blown not by enemy action, but by institutional arrogance and abuse of power. In a world where respect is earned through rank and reputation, what do you do when both are stripped away in front of 205 witnesses? Most people would crumble. Most people would accept defeat. But Sarah Chun wasn't most people. She was something else entirely, something her tormentors were about to discover in the most shocking way possible. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of West Point Military Academy as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her uniform one final time before entering the main assembly hall. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another mid-ranking officer attending the weekly disciplinary review. Unremarkable, quietly professional, and forgettable. Her black hair was pulled back in regulation style, her posture correct but not commanding, and her expression neutral in the way that military personnel perfect after years of service. What none of the 205 cadets filing into their seats knew was that Sarah Chun's real identity was buried under layers of classification so deep that only 7 people in the entire Department of Defense knew her true role. To the academy, she was Lieutenant Sarah Chun, transferred from a desk job in logistics 6 months ago to serve as a junior instructor in tactical operations. Her file showed a decent but unremarkable service record. No major commendations, no significant failures, just the steady progression of competent but uninspiring career military officer. The reality was far different. Sarah Chun was Commander Phoenix, one of 3 active Black Ops commanders in the United States military, with operational authority that superseded most general officers when activated. Her missions were the ones that never appeared in briefings, the operations that left no paper trails, the interventions that prevented international incidents from escalating into full-scale wars. She had coordinated rescue operations in hostile territory, eliminated threats that could have destabilized entire regions, and gathered intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. But today, none of that mattered. Today, she was just Lieutenant Chun, and she was about to face the consequences of a mission that had gone sideways 3 weeks ago. Colonel Marcus Briggs strode onto the stage with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own authority. At 52, he was everything the military academy system produced and celebrated: tall, stern, with a chest full of ribbons, and a reputation for crushing insubordination wherever he found it. His voice carried across the silent assembly hall as he began the morning's proceedings. Today, we address a matter of grave concern regarding military discipline and respect for the chain of command, Briggs announced, his eyes scanning the rows of cadets. It has come to my attention that certain officers in our ranks believe they are above the rules that govern our institution. Sarah sat perfectly still in the 3rd row, her hands folded in her lap. She knew what was coming. 3 weeks ago, during a training exercise that was actually a cover for a classified operation, she had been forced to make a choice between maintaining her cover and following a direct order from Colonel Briggs that would have compromised a real mission in progress. The operation involved extracting an undercover agent from a terrorist cell that had been years in the making. Briggs' order would have required her to abandon her position at a critical moment, potentially exposing not just her own identity, but the identity of 3 other operatives in the field. She had followed her actual orders from her Black Ops superiors, not Briggs' uninformed command. To him, it looked like simple insubordination from a junior officer who thought she knew better than her commanding officer. He had no way of knowing that her real commanding officer held a rank equivalent to a 4-star general and reported directly to the Secretary of Defense. Lieutenant Sarah Chun Briggs called out, his voice carrying across the silent hall. Please stand and approach the platform. Every eye in the room turned towards Sarah as she rose from her seat. She moved with measured steps, neither hurrying nor dragging her feet. Her face showed no emotion as she walked the length of the hall, aware that 205 future officers were watching her every move, learning from whatever example was about to be made. The cadet in the front row closest to the aisle was Michael Rodriguez, a third-year student who had been in several of Sarah's tactical classes. He had always found her instruction methods unusual. She had a way of explaining combat scenarios that seemed to come from real experience rather than textbook knowledge. Her examples were too specific, too detailed, filled with the kind of practical wisdom that only came from actual field operations. Now, watching her walk toward what was obviously going to be a public humiliation, he felt a strange sense that something wasn't right about the situation. Behind him, Cadet Amanda Foster leaned forward slightly. She had grown up in a military family and had an instinct for reading the subtle dynamics of rank and authority. There was something about Lieutenant Chun that had always puzzled her. The way other instructors seemed slightly deferential around her despite her lower rank. The way she carried herself with a quiet confidence that didn't match her official position. Foster had noticed that Chun never socialized with other officers of similar rank, never complained about assignments, and seemed to have an unusual amount of autonomy in how she structured her classes. Lieutenant Chun, Colonel Briggs began as Sarah reached the platform and came to attention before him. 3 weeks ago, during Exercise Northern Storm, you were given a direct order by your superior officer. That order was clear, specific, and left no room for interpretation. You chose to ignore that order. Sarah looked straight ahead, her voice steady as she replied. Sir, I follow the orders I was given. The orders you were given were from me. Briggs' voice rose slightly, playing to his audience. I ordered you to report to Checkpoint Charlie at 1,400 hours. Instead, you remained at your unauthorized position until 1730 hours. You left your assigned team without communication for over 3 hours. You directly disobeyed a superior officer. In the audience, several cadets shifted uncomfortably. The charges were serious. Disobeying orders in a training exercise might result in disciplinary action and remedial training, but the way Colonel Briggs was presenting the situation suggested something more severe was coming. What none of them could know was the conversation Sarah had been having through her encrypted communication system during those 3 hours. While Briggs believed she was simply being stubborn and insubordinate, she was actually coordinating the extraction of Agent Martinez from a terrorist cell in Central America. The operation required split-second timing, and her position in the training exercise provided the perfect cover for maintaining communication without raising suspicion. Furthermore, Briggs continued, your attitude during the subsequent debriefing showed a complete lack of respect for military hierarchy. When questioned about your actions, you refused to provide adequate explanation and showed no remorse for your insubordination. Sarah had indeed refused to explain her actions in detail during the debriefing. The real reason for her behavior was classified at a level that Colonel Briggs didn't have clearance to access. She couldn't tell him about Agent Martinez without compromising ongoing operations. She couldn't reveal her true identity without potentially exposing other Black Ops personnel who might be operating under similar covers throughout the military system. The irony was that her silence, which Briggs interpreted as arrogant defiance, was actually the highest form of military discipline, protecting classified information at personal cost. Lieutenant Chun, Briggs said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, your behavior represents everything that is wrong with today's military culture. The belief that individual judgment can supersede clear chain of command. The arrogance to assume you know better than your superior officers. The complete disregard for the team dynamics that are essential to military success. Cadet Rodriguez found himself clenching his fists. He had been in several simulated combat scenarios with Lieutenant Chun during training exercises, and her performance had been extraordinary. She seemed to anticipate enemy movements, coordinate team responses, and make tactical decisions with a speed and accuracy that impressed even the senior instructors. The idea that she was arrogant or individualistic didn't match his experience of working under her command. In civilian life, Briggs continued, walking slowly around Sarah as she stood at attention. Such behavior might be tolerated. Some corporations even reward this kind of thinking outside the box. But in the military, there is no room for individual interpretation. There is no place for personal judgment that contradicts direct orders. There is only obedience, discipline, and respect for the chain of command. The speech was clearly rehearsed, designed to make an impact on the watching cadets. Briggs was using Sarah's case as a teaching moment, an example of what happened to officers who forgot their place in the military hierarchy. What he didn't realize was that he was about to create a very different kind of teaching moment, one about the dangers of exercising authority without understanding the full context of a situation. For these reasons, Briggs announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent assembly hall, I am hereby stripping Lieutenant Sarah Chun of her current rank and privileges. Effective immediately, she will be reduced to the rank of second lieutenant and transferred to remedial training for a minimum of 6 months. A murmur ran through the assembly. Rank reduction was serious. It affected pay, privileges, career advancement, and military reputation. It was the kind of punishment that could effectively end a military career, marking an officer as unreliable and unsuitable for advancement. But Briggs wasn't finished. Furthermore, to ensure that the severity of this situation is clearly understood by all personnel, this reduction in rank will be noted in Lieutenant Chen's permanent record with a full explanation of the insubordination that led to this action. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. Internally, she was calculating options and possibilities. Her actual superiors would be furious when they learned about this development, but their anger would be directed at the situation rather than at her. She had followed her real orders correctly and protected classified information appropriately. The Black Ops command structure would sort out this mess, but the process might take weeks, and the damage to her cover might be irreparable. More concerning was the possibility that this public humiliation might compromise other operations. If her unusual reaction to the rank reduction drew attention, if someone began investigating her background more deeply, if the wrong people started asking questions about Lieutenant Sarah Chen's real qualifications and experience, the entire network of Black Ops personnel operating under academic and training covers might be exposed. However, Briggs continued, clearly enjoying his moment of absolute authority. I believe in giving officers opportunities to learn from their mistakes. Second Lieutenant Chun will remain at this academy for her remedial training, where she can observe proper military discipline and hopefully internalize the lesson she has failed to learn thus far. In the audience, Cadet Foster felt a chill of apprehension. She had grown up watching her father, a career Air Force officer, interact with personnel at various levels. She had learned to read the subtle signs of rank, authority, and respect that flowed through military interactions. Something about this entire situation felt wrong to her. The way Lieutenant Chun was accepting this humiliation, not with the defeated posture of someone who had been genuinely caught in wrongdoing, but with the controlled stillness of someone who was enduring necessary unpleasantness for larger strategic reasons. Foster had noticed other things about Lieutenant Chun over the months since her arrival. The way she sometimes received phone calls that required her to step away from classes with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to her apparent rank. The way she occasionally used tactical terminology that was more advanced than what was typically taught at their level. The way she had once corrected a textbook during a lecture, providing information that was later verified as accurate, but wasn't available in any of their standard references. The decision in this matter is final, Briggs announced. Second Lieutenant Chun will report to Remedial Training Command tomorrow morning at 0600 hours. Her instructor privileges are revoked immediately. Her access to classified training materials is suspended pending review. Her quarters will be moved to the junior officers section, and her pay will be adjusted to reflect her new rank. Sarah snapped a crisp salute and replied in a clear voice, "Understood, sir." As she turned to leave the platform, she caught sight of several familiar faces in the audience. These were cadets she had worked with, young officers she had been training in tactical operations and strategic thinking. Some looked shocked, others confused. A few seemed angry on her behalf. She had enjoyed teaching them, had been impressed by their potential, and had taken satisfaction in preparing them for the challenges they would face as military leaders. Now, they were learning a different lesson about the absolute nature of military authority, about the consequences of challenging the chain of command, and about how quickly a career could be destroyed by a single incident of perceived insubordination. What they couldn't know was that they were also witnessing something much rarer, the the sight of someone with real power choosing to accept injustice rather than compromise larger operational security. They were watching a master of warfare submit to public humiliation because the alternative might expose classified operations that were protecting American lives around the world. As Sarah walked back down the aisle toward her seat, the silence in the assembly hall was complete. 205 cadets watched her every step, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Some saw confirmation of military justice, an arrogant officer receiving appropriate consequences for insubordination. Others sensed something deeper and more complex, a story with layers they couldn't quite understand. None of them realized they had just watched the opening act of a drama that would transform their understanding of authority, justice, and the hidden complexities of military service. None of them imagined that within 72 hours, this quiet moment of institutional discipline would explode into a crisis that would reach the highest levels of the Pentagon and fundamentally change how the Academy handled personnel management. But all of that was still in the future. For now, there was only the silence, the slow footsteps of a demoted officer returning to her seat, and the lingering sense that something important had just happened, something whose true meaning none of them yet understood. Cadet Amanda Foster couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with what had happened in the assembly hall. 3 days had passed since Lieutenant Chin's public demotion, and the more Foster thought about it, the more convinced she became that there were pieces of the story that didn't fit together. She found herself sitting in the Academy library, ostensibly studying tactical operations, but actually researching everything she could find about Lieutenant Sarah Chun. What she discovered only deepened her confusion. Chen's official military record was surprisingly thin for someone who carried herself with such quiet confidence. Her previous assignments were mostly logistics and support roles, exactly the kind of background that would suggest a competent but unremarkable officer, not someone who demonstrated the tactical brilliance Foster had witnessed in training exercises. Yet Foster remembered specific incidents that contradicted this official narrative. During a simulated urban warfare exercise 2 months ago, Chun had identified a sniper position that none of the other instructors had spotted. Her explanation of enemy movement patterns had been so detailed and accurate that the exercise coordinator had asked her where she had learned such techniques. Chun had simply replied that she had studied the manuals thoroughly. But Foster knew military manuals. She had been raised on them. Her father was Colonel James Foster, a decorated Air Force officer with 30 years of experience, and he had taught her to recognize the difference between textbook knowledge and practical experience. Chen's insights came from experience, real, dangerous, life-or-death experience. Foster's investigation was interrupted when she noticed another cadet approaching her table. Michael Rodriguez looked as troubled as she felt. They had never been close friends, but they had worked together in several of Chen's tactical classes and shared a mutual respect. "Can I sit down?" Rodriguez asked, glancing around to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. Foster nodded, closing the file she had been reading. Rodriguez settled into the chair across from her and leaned forward, speaking in a low voice. "You've been thinking about what happened to Lieutenant Chin too, haven't you?" "Yeah," Foster admitted. "Something about the whole situation doesn't feel right." Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook and opened it to a page covered with his careful handwriting. "I've been thinking about it too. Actually, I've been thinking about it obsessively. I started making notes about things that bothered me, and the list just keeps getting longer." Foster leaned closer to look at the notebook. Rodriguez had documented a series of observations about Lieutenant Chin's behavior and knowledge that painted a picture of someone far more experienced than her official record suggested. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, pointing to one entry. "Remember the night navigation exercise last month? Chin was supposed to be our backup observer, but she ended up basically running the entire operation. She knew the terrain better than the primary instructor, and she seemed to have real-time knowledge of weather patterns and enemy positioning that wasn't in any of our briefing materials." Foster nodded. She remembered that exercise. They had been working with night vision equipment in unfamiliar territory, and Chun had guided them through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate safely in the dark. At the time, Foster had assumed Chun had spent extra time studying topographical maps, but looking back, her knowledge had been too immediate, too practical. And here, Rodriguez continued, flipping to another page. "During the hostage rescue simulation 3 weeks ago, Chin demonstrated combat techniques that aren't taught at our level. When Cadet Johnson asked her where she had learned them, she said she had picked them up during cross-training with other branches. But I checked. There's no record of her participating in any cross-training programs. Foster felt a chill of realization. You think her official record is incomplete? I think her official record is deliberately misleading, Rodriguez said quietly. I think Lieutenant Sarah Chun is not who she appears to be. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cadet Kevin Park, a fourth-year student who had been working as a student aide in the administration office. Park looked around nervously before joining them at the table. I heard you two talking about Lieutenant Chun, he said in a whisper. I think you need to know something, but you didn't hear this from me. Foster and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Park had a reputation for being cautious and rule-following. If he was willing to share unofficial information, it must be significant. What did you find? Foster asked. I was filing paperwork yesterday when I overheard Colonel Briggs on the phone with someone at the Pentagon. Park said he was asking for clarification about Chen's background check and security clearance. The person on the other end must have told him something that upset him because he got really quiet and then asked to speak to someone with higher authority. Rodriguez leaned forward. What happened then? That's when it got really weird, Park continued. Briggs was put on hold for like 20 minutes. When the call resumed, he barely said anything except yes, sir, and understood, sir, over and over. Then he hung up and just sat there staring at his desk for a long time. Foster felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to click together. Did he say anything else? Make any other calls? That's the strange part, Park said. Usually after personnel actions like demotions, there's a lot of paperwork to process and reports to file. But I haven't seen any follow-up documentation about Chen's case. It's like Briggs is waiting for something before making it official. The three cadets sat in silence for a moment, processing the implications of what they were discovering. If Chen's background was more complicated than it appeared, if the Pentagon was involved in ways that Colonel Briggs hadn't expected, then the public humiliation in the assembly hall might have consequences that none of them had anticipated. There's something else, Foster said slowly. I've been watching Chun since the assembly. Most officers who get demoted show some kind of emotional response. Anger, depression, embarrassment. Chun acts like nothing happened. She follows her new orders perfectly, but she doesn't seem affected by the humiliation at all. Rodriguez nodded. I noticed that too. It's like she's playing a role, going through the motions of being a demoted officer without actually caring about it. Or like she knows something we don't, Park added. Like she knows this situation is temporary. Their discussion was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the Academy's senior instructors, was walking through the library with an expression of barely controlled anger. She paused when she noticed the three cadets at their table. Cadets, she said curtly. Foster, Rodriguez, Park, you're all in Lieutenant Chen's tactical operations program, aren't you? Yes, ma'am, Foster replied. I want you to know that changes will be made to that program, Walsh said. Lieutenant Chen's situation has created some complications. Until further notice, your tactical operations classes will be covered by other instructors. Rodriguez felt a surge of disappointment. Chen's classes have been the most valuable part of his education at the Academy. Ma'am, will Lieutenant Chun be returning to teaching duties? Captain Walsh's expression darkened. Lieutenant Chen's future at this academy is under review. I suggest you focus on your other studies and avoid getting involved in matters that are above your pay grade. After Walsh left, the three cadets exchanged worried looks. The captain's warning had been clear. They were supposed to stop asking questions and mind their own business. But the warning itself was another piece of the puzzle. Why would a routine disciplinary action require such secrecy and high-level review? Foster made a decision. My father is stationed at the Pentagon. I'm going to call him tonight and see if he knows anything about this situation. Is that wise? Park asked. If Captain Walsh is telling us to stay out of it. Captain Walsh is scared, Foster said. Did you see her expression? She's not just annoyed about paperwork or scheduling changes. She's genuinely worried about something. Rodriguez closed his notebook. I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed. If Chun really is more than she appears to be, then there are probably reasons for the secrecy that go beyond academy politics. That evening, Foster made the call to her father from her dormitory room. Colonel James Foster was in his office late, working on budget reports for his department, when his daughter's call came through. Amanda, he said warmly, how are things at the academy? Foster had planned to ease into the conversation gradually, but she found herself blurting out her concerns. "Dad, something strange is happening here. One of our instructors was publicly demoted for insubordination, but nothing about the situation makes sense." Colonel Foster's voice became more serious. "What kind of strange?" Foster explained the entire situation. Chen's demotion, the inconsistencies in her background, the Pentagon phone calls, the unusual secrecy surrounding what should have been a routine disciplinary action. Her father listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Dad, are you still there?" "I'm here," Colonel Foster said slowly. "Amanda, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever is happening with this Lieutenant Chen situation, I want you to stay completely out of it. Don't ask questions, don't investigate, don't discuss it with other cadets." Foster was surprised by her father's intensity. "Why? What's wrong?" "I can't tell you specifics, but I can tell you that there are aspects of military operations that cadets are not equipped to understand. Sometimes people are not who they appear to be for very good reasons. Sometimes secrecy serves purposes that are more important than individual careers or academy politics." "But, Dad—" "No buts," Colonel Foster interrupted. "Promise me you'll drop this investigation." Foster felt a chill of realization. Her father's reaction confirmed her suspicions that Chun was involved in something classified, something beyond normal academy operations. But his warning also made it clear that pursuing the truth might have serious consequences. "I promise," she said reluctantly. "Good. Now, change the subject and tell me about your other classes." But Foster couldn't focus on discussing her coursework. After hanging up, she sat in her room thinking about her father's reaction. He had been genuinely concerned, not just about her safety, but about the possibility that she might accidentally interfere with something important. The next morning brought unexpected developments. Foster was walking to her first class when she noticed unusual activity around the administration building. Several vehicles with government license plates were parked outside, and men in suits were entering the building with briefcases and serious expressions. Rodriguez noticed them too. "Those aren't academy personnel," he said quietly as they passed. "Pentagon investigators," Park confirmed, joining them on the walkway. "I heard Captain Walsh talking to Colonel Briggs about it this morning. She said they were here to conduct a security review." Foster felt her stomach tighten. A security review suggested that Chen's situation involved more than simple insubordination. If investigators were being brought in from Washington, then the consequences of Briggs' decision to demote her publicly might be far more serious than anyone had anticipated. The trio reached their classroom to find that their morning tactical operations session had been canceled. A note on the door directed them to report to the library for independent study. As they walked back across campus, Foster noticed Chun emerging from the administration building, followed by two of the men in suits. Chen's expression was unreadable, but she moved with the same quiet confidence she had always displayed. The men accompanying her seemed deferential, not like investigators questioning a suspect, but like subordinates briefing a superior. Foster felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind. If Chen was being questioned by Pentagon investigators, why did she look more like she was in charge of the conversation than subject to it? The answer to that question was about to transform everything they thought they knew about Lieutenant Sarich and Colonel Marcus Briggs and the true nature of authority at their military academy. General Patricia Morrison arrived at West Point Academy at 0800 hours on Thursday morning. Her presence announced only by the sudden transformation in behavior of every officer on the base. Morrison was a legend in military circles, the first woman to achieve the rank of 4-star general in the Army, a veteran of 3 decades of service that included classified operations across 4 continents, and currently the director of Special Operations Command. Her unscheduled visit sent ripples of anxiety through the Academy administration. Colonel Briggs found himself standing at attention in his own office, sweating despite the cool morning temperature, as General Morrison reviewed files that had been classified far above his security clearance level. "Colonel Briggs," Morrison said without looking up from the documents spread across his desk, "I want you to walk me through your decision-making process regarding Lieutenant Chun." Briggs cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, the situation was clear-cut insubordination. During Exercise Northern Storm, Lieutenant Chun directly disobeyed my orders and then showed complete lack of remorse during debriefing. I felt that decisive action was necessary to maintain discipline and—" "Stop!" Morrison interrupted, finally, looking up at him. Her eyes were cold as winter steel. You felt that decisive action was necessary. Based on what information? Mom, what information did you have about Lieutenant Chin's actual mission during Exercise Northern Storm? Briggs felt the first flutter of serious worry. Ma'am, Lieutenant Chun was participating in a routine training exercise. Her mission was to follow orders and learn proper military procedure. Morrison stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where cadets were conducting their morning formations. Colonel, are you familiar with Operation Night Watch? No, ma'am. How about the Martinez extraction? No, ma'am. Briggs' voice was becoming smaller. Project Shadow Line? The Tehran Intelligence Network? The counterterrorism operations in Southeast Asia. Ma'am, I don't have clearance for those operations. Morrison turned back to face him. No, you don't. But Lieutenant Chin does. In fact, Lieutenant Chun has been running most of those operations. The color drained from Briggs' face. I don't understand. The woman you publicly humiliated in front of 205 cadets is Commander Sarah Phoenix Chun, one of 3 active Black Ops commanders in the United States military. Her security clearance is higher than mine. Her operational authority, when activated, supersedes every officer at this academy, including yourself. Briggs felt the room beginning to spin. That's impossible. Her file shows she's a logistics officer. Her record is completely ordinary. Her cover file shows she's a logistics officer, Morrison corrected. Her real file is classified at a level that requires presidential authorization to access. The ordinary record you saw was carefully constructed to allow her to operate at this academy while maintaining operational security for ongoing missions. Morrison returned to the desk and pulled out a photograph. During Exercise Northern Storm, while you thought Lieutenant Chun was being insubordinate, she was actually coordinating the extraction of Agent Martinez from a terrorist cell in Honduras. The operation required split-second timing and constant communication. Your order for her to abandon her position would have compromised not only that mission, but the entire network of operatives we've spent 3 years building in Central America. Briggs slumped into his chair. How was I supposed to know? You weren't supposed to know, Morrison said sharply. The entire point of deep cover operations is that the people around our operatives don't know who they really are. But you were supposed to trust that if a competent officer was refusing to follow orders, there might be a good reason. Ma'am, with respect, how could I make that assumption? If every junior officer who disobeyed orders claimed to have secret reasons, Colonel Briggs, Morrison interrupted. In 30 years of military service, how many times have you encountered an officer who refused to explain their insubordination even when facing serious consequences? Briggs thought about it. Never, ma'am. Usually officers who break protocol are eager to explain their reasoning, even if their explanations are inadequate. Exactly. Commander Chin's silence should have been your first clue that something unusual was happening. Her willingness to accept punishment without defending herself should have been your second clue. The fact that she showed no emotional response to public humiliation should have been your third clue. Morrison moved around the desk to stand directly in front of Briggs. But instead of recognizing these warning signs, you decided to make an example of her. You turned what should have been a private matter into a public spectacle. You compromised the cover of one of our most valuable operatives because your ego was bruised by an officer who wouldn't explain herself. Ma'am, what are the consequences of this situation? Morrison's expression became even more serious. Commander Chin's cover at this academy is blown. We'll have to extract her and rebuild her identity for future operations. The 3-year mission she was running while stationed here will have to be transferred to another operative, probably setting us back months. And, worst of all, her public humiliation has been witnessed by 205 future officers who will carry stories about the incompetent lieutenant who was stripped of rank for insubordination. Briggs felt sick. Is there anything I could do to fix this? That depends on how willing you are to make this situation right, Morrison said. Because what I'm about to tell you next is going to require you to swallow your pride completely. Meanwhile, in the administration building's secure conference room, Commander Sarah Chun was briefing a team of Pentagon investigators on the operations she had been conducting while maintaining her cover at the academy. Her real identity had been revealed to the investigation team, and she was speaking with the authority and expertise that came with her actual rank and experience. The primary mission has been the development of what we call the Future Leaders Network, Chin explained, gesturing to files spread across the conference table. We identified 47 cadets currently at this academy who show exceptional potential for special operations work. My role was to evaluate them in realistic scenarios, provide advanced training without revealing the true nature of that training, and prepare preliminary recruitment assessments. Agent David Park, no relation to Cadet Park, looked up from his notes. And the public demotion has compromised this mission. Completely, Chun confirmed. The cadets I've been evaluating now view me as a disgraced officer who is rightfully punished for insubordination. Several of them have already begun distancing themselves from techniques I taught them, assuming that my methods were somehow flawed or inappropriate. What about the cadets who are investigating your background? Our surveillance indicates that at least 3 cadets have been asking questions and conducting unauthorized research into your identity. Chun allowed herself a small smile. Those 3 are actually the most promising candidates in the entire program. Foster, Rodriguez, and Park have demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking, initiative, and questioning of authority that we look for in special operations personnel. Their investigation into my background shows intelligence-gathering skills that are remarkable for cadets at their level. Are they a security risk? On the contrary, Chun said, they've been careful, discreet, and methodical. They recognized inconsistencies and pursued them without compromising operational security or discussing their suspicions with unauthorized personnel. Under different circumstances, I would be recommending all 3 for immediate recruitment into preliminary special operations training. Agent Park made a note. And now they're learning the wrong lessons, Chun said, her satisfaction fading. Instead of seeing their investigation as successful intelligence work, they're being told to mind their own business and stay out of matters above their pay grade. Instead of being rewarded for recognizing that something didn't fit the official narrative, they're being discouraged from questioning authority. The briefing was interrupted by a knock on the door. General Morrison entered, followed by Colonel Briggs, who looked like he was walking to his own execution. General, Chun said, rising to attention. Commander, Morrison replied. I've been briefing Colonel Briggs on the actual situation. He has something he would like to say to you. Briggs stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Commander Chun, I owe you an apology that no words can adequately express. I acted without full information, made assumptions that were completely wrong, and compromised your mission through my own arrogance and poor judgment. Chun looked at him steadily. Colonel, you acted based on the information you had available. The failure was in the system that put us both in an impossible situation, not in your individual decision-making. Ma'am, that's generous, but it doesn't change the fact that I publicly humiliated you in front of 205 cadets based on my own misconceptions about your authority and mission. Morrison stepped forward, which brings us to the question of how to address this situation. Commander Chin's cover is blown, but the manner in which we handle the revelation will determine how much damage has been done to ongoing operations. Chin turned to Morrison. General, I have a recommendation. Let's hear it. I believe we should use this situation as a teaching moment. Instead of trying to quietly reverse the demotion and hope the cadets don't ask questions, I think we should be transparent about what happened and why. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Explain. The cadets who witnessed my demotion are going to be military leaders. Some of them will someday be in positions where they need to recognize that their subordinates might have access to information they don't have. They need to understand that true military discipline sometimes means knowing when not to demand immediate explanations. Agent Park looked concerned. Wouldn't revealing your true identity compromise other deep cover operations? Not if we do it correctly, Chin said. We don't need to reveal specific operations or current personnel, but we can use this as an educational opportunity about the complexity of modern military operations and the importance of understanding that authority comes in many forms. Morrison was silent for a long moment, considering the proposal. You're suggesting we turn Colonel Briggs' mistake into a training exercise. I'm suggesting we turn my blown cover into an opportunity to train 205 future officers about the realities of command in the modern military, Chin corrected. They're going to learn about special operations eventually. They're going to encounter situations where the official narrative doesn't tell the whole story. Better to teach them how to handle those situations now, while they're still cadets, than to hope they figure out on their own when lives are at stake. Briggs looked up. What would this mean for my career? Morrison's expression was unforgiving. Colonel, your career concerns are secondary to operational security and the training of future officers. But if you're willing to participate in this educational process, to stand in front of those same 205 cadets and explain how your own assumptions led to a serious mistake, then we might be able to salvage something positive from this disaster. Chen added, the cadets need to see that admitting mistakes and learning from them is part of military leadership. They need to understand that authority comes with responsibility, and that responsibility includes recognizing when you don't have all the information. Morrison nodded slowly. Very well. We'll convene another assembly tomorrow morning. Colonel Briggs, you will explain to those cadets exactly what happened and why. Commander Chun, you will discuss the realities of special operations work and the importance of operational security. And we will all hope that this educational experiment produces better military leaders instead of compromising national security. As the meeting broke up, Chen found herself thinking about Foster, Rodriguez, and Park. Tomorrow, they would learn that their investigation had been correct, that their instincts had been sound, and that questioning authority, when done thoughtfully and discreetly, was exactly the kind of behavior the military needed from its future leaders. But they would also learn a more complex lesson about the nature of truth, authority, and the hidden structures that shape their world in ways they were only beginning to understand. The assembly hall felt different on Friday morning. The same 205 cadets filed into their seats, but the atmosphere was charged with tension and curiosity. Word had spread through the academy that something significant was happening. The presence of Pentagon officials, the mysterious meetings in the administration building, and the unusual behavior of the faculty had created an undercurrent of speculation that hummed through every conversation. Amanda Foster sat in the same seat she had occupied during Sarah Chen's demotion, but this time she was watching for details with the sharp attention her investigation had taught her. Michael Rodriguez was 2 rows behind her, his notebook ready despite not knowing what he might need to record. Kevin Park was near the front, having used his administrative connections to position himself where he could observe both the speakers and the audience reactions. At 0800 hours exactly, General Morrison strode onto the stage, her presence immediately commanding absolute silence from the assembled cadets. Behind her followed Colonel Briggs, whose pale complexion and nervous demeanor stood in stark contrast to his usually confident authority. Last came Lieutenant Sarah Chun, but something about her bearing had changed completely from the subdued, compliant posture she had maintained since her demotion. Foster felt a jolt of recognition. This was the Sarah Chun from their tactical exercises, confident, alert, carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. The transformation was so complete that Foster wondered how she had failed to notice the discrepancy before. General Morrison stepped to the podium and looked out over the silent assembly. Cadets, you are about to receive an education in the complexities of modern military operations. What you learned this morning will stay within these walls, but it will inform your understanding of command responsibility for the rest of your careers. Rodriguez felt his pulse quicken. This was it. The explanation they had been seeking, delivered by the highest-ranking officer most of them had ever seen in person. 1 week ago, Morrison continued, you witnessed what appeared to be a routine disciplinary action against Lieutenant Sarah Chun. You saw an officer reduced in rank for insubordination and disrespect for the chain of command. That incident will now serve as the foundation for a lesson about the assumptions we make when we don't have all the information. Morrison gestured toward Colonel Briggs. Colonel Briggs will begin by explaining his decision-making process during that incident. Briggs stepped to the podium, his hands visibly trembling as he gripped the edges. Cadets, what you are about to hear is the most difficult admission I will ever make in my military career. 1 week ago, I made a decision based on incomplete information that resulted in serious damage to ongoing military operations and the public humiliation of one of our military's most valuable officers. A murmur ran through the assembly. This was not what anyone had expected. During Exercise Northern Storm, Briggs continued, I gave Lieutenant Chun a direct order to report to Checkpoint Charlie at 1,400 hours. When she failed to follow that order, I assumed she was being insubordinate. When she refused to explain her actions during debriefing, I assumed she was showing disrespect for authority. When she accepted her punishment without defending herself, I assumed she knew she was guilty of wrongdoing. Briggs paused, gathering himself for what came next. I was wrong about every single assumption. Foster leaned forward, her mind racing. If Chen hadn't been insubordinate, then what had she been doing? The truth, Briggs said, his voice growing stronger, is that Lieutenant Sarah Chun was following orders during Exercise Northern Storm. Orders from a commanding authority that superseded my own. She couldn't explain her actions because doing so would have compromised classified operations. She accepted punishment without defending herself because protecting national security was more important to her than protecting her career. Rodriguez felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. The advanced tactical knowledge, the unusual autonomy, the way Chun had seemed unaffected by her demotion. It all made sense if she was operating under a different authority structure entirely. Morrison returned to the podium. What Colonel Briggs discovered, and what you are about to learn, is that the United States military operates on multiple levels simultaneously. While most military personnel follow conventional chain of command structures, a small number of highly trained individuals work within classified systems that require different approaches to authority, discipline, and accountability. The general gestured toward Chun. The woman you know as Lieutenant Sarah Chun is actually Commander Sarah Phoenix Chun, one of 3 active Black Ops commanders in the United States military. Her real rank is equivalent to a full colonel, and her security clearance exceeds that of every officer at this academy, including myself. The silence in the assembly hall was complete. Foster felt as if her understanding of reality had been fundamentally altered. The quiet instructor who had taught them tactical operations was one of the most elite military operatives in the country. Chin stepped to the podium, and, when she spoke, her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than following them. For the past 8 months, I have been operating under deep cover at this academy. My mission was twofold: to conduct advanced training for selected cadets who showed potential for special operations work, and to run ongoing intelligence operations that required academic institutional cover. Park felt a chill of recognition. He and his fellow cadets hadn't just been learning from a disgraced lieutenant. They had been receiving instruction from one of the military's most elite operatives. During Exercise Northern Storm, Chun continued, I was coordinating the extraction of an undercover agent from a terrorist cell in Honduras. The operation required constant communication and precise timing. Colonel Briggs' order for me to abandon my position would have compromised not only that mission, but an entire network of operatives we had spent years developing. Rodriguez thought about that day, remembering how Chun had remained to her position despite repeated orders to relocate. At the time, it had seemed like stubborn defiance. Now he understood it had been life-or-death operational necessity. I chose to follow my actual orders rather than Colonel Briggs' uninformed command, Chin said. This choice saved the lives of at least 3 operatives and prevented the exposure of intelligence networks that are still protecting American interests today. Morrison resumed her position at the podium. The question we now face is what lessons you will take from this experience. You have learned that authority structures can be complex and hidden. You have learned that sometimes people who appear to be insubordinate are actually following higher orders. You have learned that making assumptions without complete information can have serious consequences. Foster found herself thinking about her own investigation, about the way she and her friends had been discouraged from asking questions. Now she understood that their curiosity had been exactly the right response. They had recognized that something didn't fit the official narrative and had pursued the truth despite official discouragement. But the most important lesson, Morrison continued, is about the nature of command responsibility itself. As future officers, you will someday be in positions where subordinates have access to information you don't have. Your challenge will be learning to distinguish between genuine insubordination and justified deviation from your orders. Chin stepped forward again. During my time here, I have been evaluating many of you for potential special operations work. What I look for is not blind obedience, but thoughtful analysis. Not immediate compliance, but the ability to recognize when situations are more complex than they initially appear. She looked directly at Foster, Rodriguez, and Park. Some of you demonstrated exceptional analytical skills over the past week by recognizing inconsistencies in the official narrative and pursuing those questions despite being discouraged from doing so. That behavior, careful investigation combined with discretion and respect for security concerns, is exactly what we look for in special operations personnel. Foster felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement. Their investigation hadn't been amateur meddling. It had been the kind of thinking that elite military units valued. Morrison took control again. What happened this week will not leave this room. Commander Chin's true identity and mission are classified, and discussing them outside this assembly would compromise ongoing operations and endanger lives. But the lessons you've learned about authority, judgment, and the complexity of military operations will serve you throughout your careers. Colonel Briggs returned to the podium for his final statement. I want each of you to understand that the mistake I made, assuming I had complete information when I didn't, is one that any of you could make in the future. The difference between successful leaders and failed leaders is often the willingness to question your own assumptions and the humility to recognize when you might be wrong. Chun concluded the presentation. You are the future of military leadership. Some of you will command conventional units where clear chain of command structures guide every decision. Others will work in special operations environments where authority is more complex and decisions must be made with incomplete information. All of you will face situations where the obvious answer is not the correct answer. As the assembly concluded, Foster found herself looking at her fellow cadets with new understanding. They had all witnessed something unprecedented. The revelation of military operations they hadn't known existed, the acknowledgement of authority structures they hadn't imagined, and, most importantly, the demonstration that questioning assumptions and pursuing truth were not just acceptable, but essential qualities for military leadership. Rodriguez closed his notebook, realizing that the most important lesson couldn't be written down. It was about learning to live with uncertainty, to make decisions with incomplete information, and to maintain the intellectual curiosity that would help them navigate the complex realities of military service. Park thought about his future in the military with a new perspective. The administrative work he had been planning to pursue suddenly seemed less appealing than the complex, challenging world of special operations that had been revealed to them. But all of them understood that they had been trusted with information that could compromise national security if mishandled. They had been treated as future officers worthy of understanding the hidden complexities of the military they would soon serve. As they filed out of the assembly hall, the cadets carried with them a new understanding of authority, responsibility, and the hidden structures that shaped their world. They had learned that reality was more complex than official narratives suggested, and that the most important military skill might be the ability to recognize when the obvious answer was wrong. Most importantly, they had learned that in a world where information was compartmentalized and authority structures were complex, the ability to think critically and question assumptions wasn't just valuable. It was essential for protecting the lives and interests of the people they had sworn to serve. 3 months after the revelation in the assembly hall, West Point Military Academy had become a different institution. The changes were subtle but profound, affecting everything from how instructors approach classroom discussions to how cadets analyze command decisions during training exercises. Amanda Foster found herself in Commander Chen's office. The woman had been restored to her proper rank and given new quarters befitting her actual position, discussing her application for Special Operations Preliminary Training. The conversation was unlike any she had experienced with military personnel before. Your investigation into my background showed exactly the kind of analytical thinking we need, Chun said, reviewing Foster's file. But I'm more interested in how you handled the ethical dimensions of the situation. You recognized that pursuing the truth might have security implications, so you proceeded carefully and discreetly. Foster shifted in her chair, still adjusting to the reality that the instructor she had been investigating was now evaluating her for elite military service. Ma'am, I have to ask, were we supposed to figure it out? Was the whole situation a test? Chin smiled. Nothing about my blown cover was planned. But the way you and your classmates responded to an obviously inconsistent situation revealed things about your character and capabilities that we might never have discovered otherwise. The door opened, and Michael Rodriguez entered for his scheduled appointment. Over the past 3 months, Rodriguez had thrown himself into advanced tactical studies with a new understanding of their practical applications. His notebook, once filled with confused observations about an apparently incompetent instructor, now contained detailed analyses of special operations techniques and strategic thinking. Rodriguez, Chin acknowledged. How did your urban warfare simulation go yesterday? Better than expected, ma'am, Rodriguez replied. I found myself thinking about the lessons from your demotion incident, about how situations that seem obvious on the surface often have hidden complexities. It changed how I approached the exercise. Chin nodded approvingly. Explain what you mean. During the simulation, My team encountered resistance that seemed poorly coordinated and ineffective. My initial instinct was to press our advantage aggressively. But then I remembered how your apparent insubordination was actually sophisticated operational security, so I considered whether the enemy's apparent weakness might be deception. And what did you discover? The weak resistance was designed to draw us into a kill zone. By questioning the obvious interpretation of the situation, we avoided a trap that eliminated 2 other teams. Chen made a note in Rodriguez's file. The kind of tactical thinking he was describing was exactly what special operations units needed. The ability to look beyond surface appearances and consider multiple possible explanations for observed behavior. Kevin Park knocked and entered for the final appointment of the afternoon. Over the past months, Park had discovered that his administrative experience gave him unique insights into how information flowed through military bureaucracies, skills that were highly valued in intelligence operations. Park, Chin said, I understand you've been working on a project to analyze communication patterns during training exercises. Yes, ma'am, Park replied, producing a thick folder. I've been tracking how information moves through different command structures during simulations, looking for bottlenecks and vulnerabilities. The goal is to understand how critical intelligence might be delayed or distorted as it passes through normal channels. Chen reviewed the documents Park had prepared. His analysis was sophisticated and thorough, identifying specific points in the Academy's training scenarios where information flow could be improved. More importantly, his work showed understanding of how bureaucratic structures could inadvertently compromise operational effectiveness. This is excellent work, Chen said. Have you considered how these patterns might apply to special operations environments where information must be protected from certain personnel even within the same unit? Park's eyes lit up with understanding. You mean situations like yours, where operational security requires compartmentalization of information? Exactly. In special operations, managing information flow isn't just about efficiency. It's about protecting lives and mission integrity. As the individual meetings concluded, Chen reflected on the broader changes that had swept through the Academy following her revealed identity. The incident had forced everyone, instructors and cadets alike, to reconsider their assumptions about authority, information, and decision-making. General Morrison had visited the Academy twice since the revelation, monitoring how the educational experiment was progressing. Her reports to Pentagon leadership described significant improvements in critical thinking among cadets, better recognition of complex authority structures, and increased awareness of the hidden dimensions of military operations. But the changes went beyond individual development. The Academy had quietly modified several training programs to include scenarios where cadets encountered conflicting information, ambiguous authority structures, and situations where the obvious course of action was incorrect. These modifications were designed to prepare future officers for the realities of modern military service, where clear-cut situations were increasingly rare. Colonel Briggs had emerged from the crisis as a different kind of leader. His public acknowledgement of error and subsequent efforts to learn from the experience had earned respect from both cadets and fellow officers. He had spent the intervening months studying special operations protocols and developing a deeper understanding of how conventional military structures interfaced with classified systems. The hardest part, Briggs had told Morrison during her last visit, is learning to live with uncertainty. I spent 25 years believing that military leadership meant having clear answers and decisive authority. Now I understand that sometimes the most important leadership skill is knowing when you don't know enough to make a decision. The 3 cadets who had investigated Chen's background had become unofficial case studies in how future officers should approach complex situations. Their careful investigation, discretionary behavior, and willingness to question official narratives while respecting security concerns had become models for analytical thinking that were discussed in leadership classes throughout the Academy. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the Academy handled information itself, where once classification levels and need-to-know restrictions had been absolute barriers. The institution had developed more nuanced approaches to information sharing that acknowledged the complexity of modern military operations. Foster, Rodriguez, and Park had all been accepted into preliminary special operations training programs, their applications fast-tracked based on Chen's recommendations. But they weren't the only cadets whose careers had been influenced by the revelation. Throughout their class, Cadets had begun approaching their studies with new appreciation for the hidden complexities of military service. As Chun prepared to leave her office that evening, she received a secure communication from her actual superiors in the Special Operations Command. Her next assignment would take her to a diplomatic posting in Eastern Europe, where her academic cover would be replaced by a State Department identity for operations related to emerging security threats. The past 8 months at West Point had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. Not only had she identified and begun training promising candidates for special operations work, but the accidental revelation of her identity had created educational opportunities that would influence military leadership for years to come. Walking across the academy grounds for one of the last times, Chen encountered small groups of cadets engaged in the kind of thoughtful discussions that had become common since the assembly revelation. They were debating tactical scenarios, questioning conventional wisdom, and demonstrating the intellectual curiosity that was essential for effective military leadership. Near the library, she overheard Foster explaining to a group of younger cadets how to recognize when situations might be more complex than they appeared. Rodriguez was demonstrating tactical analysis techniques that went beyond textbook scenarios. Park was discussing information security in ways that showed sophisticated understanding of operational requirements. These cadets would graduate in 18 months, carrying with them lessons about authority, judgment, and critical thinking that would serve them throughout their careers. Some would pursue conventional military paths, applying their enhanced analytical skills to traditional command roles. Others would be recruited into special operations units, where their ability to navigate complex, ambiguous situations would protect American interests around the world. The incident that began with Colonel Briggs' mistake and Chen's blown cover had evolved into something unprecedented, a real-world demonstration of how military education could be transformed to meet the challenges of modern warfare and international security. As Chun reached her quarters, she reflected on the irony of the situation. Her most successful mission at the academy hadn't been the classified operations she had conducted while maintaining her cover. Instead, it had been the unplanned educational experiment that emerged from the crisis of her exposed identity. The 205 cadets who had witnessed her public emotion and subsequent revelation had learned lessons about leadership, authority, and critical thinking that no traditional curriculum could have provided. They had seen firsthand how assumptions could lead to serious mistakes, how questioning authority could be both necessary and dangerous, and how the most important military skill might be the ability to recognize when obvious answers were wrong. More importantly, they had learned that military service in the 21st century required intellectual flexibility, moral courage, and the ability to operate effectively in environments where information was incomplete and authority structures were complex. The transformation of West Point Military Academy would continue long after Chen's departure. The cadets who had lived through the revelation would become instructors themselves, carrying forward lessons about critical thinking and complex authority that would influence generations of military leaders. But the immediate impact was clear in the confident, thoughtful bearing of cadets like Foster, Rodriguez, and Park as they prepared for careers in service of their country. They had learned that real military discipline wasn't blind obedience to authority. It was the intellectual courage to pursue truth even when that pursuit was difficult, dangerous, or officially discouraged. They had learned that the most important question any military officer could ask wasn't, "What are my orders?" but, "Do I understand enough about this situation to make the right decision?" And they had learned that sometimes the greatest service they could provide to their country was the willingness to question assumptions, challenge conventional thinking, and recognize that in a complex world, the obvious answer was often wrong. These lessons would serve them well in careers that would take them to places and challenges they couldn't yet imagine, where the ability to think critically and act decisively with incomplete information would mean the difference between success and failure, between life and death, between protecting American interests and compromising national security. The woman they had known as Lieutenant Sarah Chun had given them something more valuable than tactical training or strategic knowledge. She had given them the intellectual tools they would need to navigate a world where authority was complex, information was compartmentalized, and the most important battles were often fought in shadows by people whose true identities would never be known. In the end, that was the real lesson of the demotion that became a revelation. That military service required not just courage and discipline, but the wisdom to understand that reality was always more complex than it appeared, and The humility to recognize that the most powerful people often walked among them in disguise, protecting freedoms they would never receive credit for defending.